I was in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a scout pregame, and the question that was asked to me was, "What's the deal with the Australian guys? Why can't any of them shoot? Why are they all the same?" And the characteristic was, when you really think about the guys that have come into the NBA, whether it is a guy like Josh Green, a player like Josh Giddey, Dyson Daniels. So if we just use those three scenarios, particularly when it comes to Dyson and Josh Green, they were guys that everyone knows they're going to defend. They will play team basketball. They will be tough. But the question was, why can't they shoot? And I've asked questions around what the case is. And of course, that does not mean that is the same for every Australian prospect. You look like a guy like Tyrese Proctor, who was at Duke for 3 years, and he can really shoot the ball, even though that Cavs team is stacked right now and he might not be getting rotation minutes. But I really like what Tyrese Proctor
plugged
can do.
into everything hoops. From downtown, boom shakalaka.
He is a reporter and host for ESPN Australia and New Zealand. We have the pleasure in welcoming Kane Pitman onto Hoopsology. Welcome to the show, Kane.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, and I am fired up about the state of the NBA right now on the road to the postseason, so I'm happy to chat hoops with you today.
Yeah, so before we get into that, we have a bit of a tradition on our show. So we tackle, all of the, headlines that's happening within the NBA, WNBA hoops, but we want to get into the culture of basketball. What makes the game of hoops so great? Why do people care about it? And what's their connection to it from a personal perspective? So take this question any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
Well, I have a couple. I've got one from Australian basketball back in the 90s, so I'm 35 years of age right now, and then I've got the NBA version. So I'll start with the Australian version, and the NBL, the Australian League, back in the 90s was absolute peak. It was in its heyday, and Melbourne, where I'm from, the Melbourne Tigers were the team led by Andrew Gaze and Leonard Copeland, the two superstars on that team. And back in the day, the National League used to be on free-to-air TV, so everyone could see it, everyone could watch it. The arenas were packed out. So I remember as a kid having a fascination in basketball, and then if you fast forward 25 years later, I work alongside Andrew Gaze and Leonard Copeland as well, so it's kind of like a full circle moment. Andrew Gaze is, most people would say, is the best men's basketball player in the history of Australia. So that was when I first got a little taste for it. But as far as what I would describe as the big show, the NBA, the Hollywood aspect, the celebrities, the superstars, I remember getting a glimpse of the NBA, and there was not much basketball on TV in Australia back in the early 2000s, and it was actually the Milwaukee Bucks were playing the Charlotte Hornets in the postseason, and I saw Ray Allen play basketball, and this was not just the three-point shooting Ray Allen. This was the guy that was dunking on everyone and had all the dribble moves, and I was like, Ray Allen's my guy, and from then on, I had such a fascination with the NBA. So they're the two moments that I remember being younger, and probably somewhere in the back of my mind having this idea that if I could find a way to work in basketball, it would be a dream. And then it ended up, after a long road, we got to where we are now. But I remember those two moments pretty fondly.
Speaking of that, in terms of basketball media, what is your feelings just in terms of just the state of basketball media worldwide? I was talking to some journalists from an American perspective, and particularly All-Star Weekend. They're out there covering it, and they mentioned some influencers that may not be so much basketball fans were just out there trying to get content. They said it wasn't too pervasive, but still there was some kind of weirdness going on. But you also have a global perspective. So what is kind of your feelings in terms of how the game is covered, globally in the United States? I mean, you have so many different unique perspectives compared to just your average media member that might be only have a United States perspective. So what's kind of your feelings on just basketball media these days?
It's so interesting because when I started working in media, I was just writing, and I kind of viewed that would be the path that I would go. And that's how I first started working with ESPN back in 2018. So it's been about 8 years now. And then by virtue of different opportunities and different things that came my way, I did a lot of podcasting, then I moved into some digital stuff, and then I got asked to do the TV stuff that I do now. So I feel like I've had a fair bit of experience in different elements, but I would say the one element that I'm trying to get better at, I'm trying to understand, is the social media influence that the game has. But you know this, we all do it. We get on Instagram and we get on TikTok and we look at the highlights and we look at whether it is the traditional media personalities that or it's the influencers. And I got to be honest, man, they do a great job. Now, yeah. I get it if you're an old school beat writer and Maybe the influencers are starting to get on your territory a little bit. And I understand that. We're all in a business that we understand is really hard to get work and keep work. But I must admit, I look at the way that the content comes out for the NBA. I think it's a good thing for the league. I don't think it detracts totally from what we do and the hardcore fans that are sitting there watching 5 games on different screens on League Pass every night. So I actually really appreciate it. I didn't think that it was overbearing at All-Star Weekend from what I could see. But I must admit that I am probably not the best person at actually identifying who these really mega famous influencers are. So maybe that's on me. Maybe I got to get better in that regard.
Yeah, me either. Yeah, I have. It's like half of it I've never heard of before. But some others, they love the NBA, but also maybe their other interest is technology or fashion. So they combine the two, and I think that's pretty cool that the NBA hasn't had before. So I think it just depends on who they're inviting. I think their intentions are pretty positive, even though it garnered a lot of negative headlines. I want to shift to just the Australian basketball scene. So just some context. I host the show myself and my 2 other co-hosts. The person that we started the show back in 2020, we've been best friends since middle school, born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So the Lobos have a particular connection to Australian basketball with Luke Longley, and then also with some other players within the 2000s as well. So I think myself and my co-hosts have a unique perspective in terms of how important Australia plays into the whole basketball sphere. Can you kind of explain that in terms of how important this Australia means to the world of basketball? Because I think when people think of international basketball, they think of Europe and maybe, South America. And I think they leave out Australia. And I think that's a key mistake. And I just want to kind of get your feelings in terms of, why do you think Australia's kind of left out of those conversations when they're pretty prevalent, not only in the NBA, but also within the college game as well, just through the years?
I think part of it is distance. So as I sort of pointed to, I've been in the US for, I would say, the most part of the last 8 or 9 years. There was a little COVID break in between, which a lot of people were probably trying to figure out what they were doing. But when I have conversations with people around it, certainly people now have a higher appreciation for Australian basketball. But there's not too many people you run into that have actually been to Australia, and they ask questions about what's Australia like, what's the basketball scene like. And I think it's just hard to keep track. We understand in the US, when you're here and you have the college game, you even have the high school game, then you have the NBA. WNBA is a juggernaut right now. So I think there's so much to watch. There's only so much time people have to actually give attention to the Australian League. So I think it's just out of sight, out of mind. But I would say when you mention Luke Longley, who is a legend of Australian basketball, obviously was starting for 3 of those Chicago Bulls titles teams, one of the most historic teams of all time. He is still very influential with the Australian League. He's an icon. Everyone loves talking to Luke. He's a gentleman as well. But from that period, from the 90s to a little bit earlier, when I was speaking about when I kind of discovered the NBA and found a love for the NBA, at that point in time when I was watching it, I didn't know a single other person in my friend group or anyone that I knew that was watching the NBA, that had an interest in the NBA. And a big part of that was because it wasn't as accessible. You couldn't watch these games. And for the most part, it didn't really feel like it was a genuine path for a young Australian to go on a run and make the NBA. It seemed like this faraway world that you would never be able to reach the glitz and glamour of the NBA. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades, that has completely changed. And a big part of it was Andrew Bogut, #1 overall pick in 2005. And everyone's like, well, wait a second, we had a #1 pick? How does that work? And then since then, you have Matthew Dellavedova, you've got Joe Ingles, you've got Aaron Baines, Patty Mills. And now that's why you're seeing this generation. There's double digits Australians in the league every year, and that's just a given. We expect that, and it is thanks to those guys that were able to blaze a path and actually make kids believe that this is a possibility. And now we're seeing great things for Australian basketball. And to your point, I think there is a greater understanding of what Australia brings to the table, whether it's the hard-nosed defense, the team-style basketball, and all around, generally, pretty high level of player.
Yeah, you mentioned Andrew Bogut. A little bit of harsh feelings with him just because he played for Utah, so that was a key rival of the Lobos back in the day. So I was rooting hard against him, but really solid player. And it's so interesting because the Mountain West Conference back in the day, and particularly had a lot of Australian players in the University of Mexico as well when Steve Alford was coaching the team. So I'm just curious in terms of the path of college players nowadays, or there's players in Australia in terms of wanting to play in the NBA or just wanting to play in the United States. What is the path like? What are they looking for? Do they want to play in the NBA? Do they want to play for a college team? Are you familiar in terms of how that works? In terms of you mentioned that it's easier to kind of cross that bridge from Australia to America. What are those steps are they looking for? Are they just looking to go straight pro, or are they looking for more college opportunities?
Yeah, I think the interesting conversation there, as you know, is the options that are actually on the table, and it has changed in a massive way, really, in the last 5 to 6 years, including the NBL, the Next Stars, which we might get to, the G League Ignite that was around for a couple of years, and now obviously the college game, what that can bring to the table in terms of college being not just a launch pad for a pro career, but literally the basis for a life-changing scenario. So that is now the options that people have. But as far as the college game, back over the last 2 decades, we in Australia all look at St. Mary's in California and the reputation that school has had from the early 2000s, actually discovering that there is a real talent pipeline in Australia and also New Zealand to go and recruit these guys and bring them to St. Mary's. So it's a little bit of a weird situation where over the last 15 years, all the Gales games would be on TV in Australia, which seems so random, right? But it was because there was familiar faces that people in Australia could watch. And when you think about the names that they've had over the years, Adam Capehorn, who's now an assistant coach with the Washington Wizards, but the head coach of the national team, he was at St. Mary's. Matthew Dellavedova was there. Patty Mills was there. Jock Landale was there. And keep going down the list. The high-quality players from the Australian pipeline have gone to St. Mary's. And that was probably what everyone viewed as the easiest way to go play college basketball. But now we're in a scenario this year where we're really excited about the possibility of what March Madness and the NCAA tournament could bring, because we've got, for Purdue, we've got Oscar Clough starting for that team. For Arizona, we've got Anthony Dell also coming off the bench. UConn, Jacob Furphy's there. He's not playing a lot, but he's a part of that really strong team. And go down the list for the guys that are really contributing. So it's changed again with the generations from, okay, there's a handful of guys that we can track, to now you can look and there's 100 names between the men and women that are playing college basketball all over the US. So I think the numbers have grown in terms of the high quality talent from Australia, but also the options have grown. And I think there's benefits to going to college and playing in these monster high profile games on national TV here in the US against your peers, guys of your age group. I think there's a great benefit to that.
So can you go over, you mentioned it earlier, but you kind of go more in depth in terms of the characteristics of Australian basketball, in terms of your stereotypical Australian player, like what kind of skills it might be wrong to say this, but I think with Europeans, usually there's some aspects that a lot of Europeans, share with each other, even though they might play different positions. I still think they carry some characteristics that carries over to America. So does Australia follow suit in that? And also, when they are playing for these college teams, do you think there is a transitional period? Like, how do you adjust to the American game, or do you think they're pretty adaptable to it?
It's interesting. I was in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a scout pregame, and the question that was asked to me was, what's the deal with the Australian guys? Why can't any of them shoot? Why are they all the same? And the characteristic was, when you really think about the guys that have come into the NBA, whether it is a guy like Josh Green, a player like Josh Giddey, a Dyson Daniels, so if we just use those three scenarios, particularly when it comes to Dyson and Josh Green, they were guys that everyone knows. They're going to defend. They will play team basketball. They will be tough. But the question was, why can't they shoot? And I've asked questions around what the case is. And of course, that does not mean that is the same for every Australian prospect. You look like a guy like Tyrese Proctor, who was at Duke for 3 years, and he can really shoot the ball, even though that Cavs team is stacked right now and he might not be getting rotation minutes. But I really like what Tyrese Proctor can be. But a lot of these guys in the NBA that make it to that level had come through the NBA Global Academy, which is in Canberra in Australia, which is the Australian Institute of Sport. And when you look at the way that those guys are coached, I do think that there is a great difference from the way that perhaps some players are coached here in the US, where if you're a superstar from the juniors and you are on that pedestal and you're the number one guy on that team, whereas in Australia, they collect the best talent from around the country, they are coached together, and they are taught how to play team basketball, and you're not on that pedestal. So you grow up coming through these junior ranks, playing in this global academy, and you are taught to defend. You are taught to move the ball. You are taught to hit the glass, run in transition, and play really fundamental basketball. And I do think that there's a little bit of a question in Australian basketball. Well, who's going to be the superstar? Because when you look at the international game and even how the rest of the world is getting better at basketball, whether it's France, whether it's Serbia, Germany, these teams that are powerhouses, they all have superstars. And for Australia, I think the question is they've got a highly competitive team that bats well above their average. But the one thing they don't have right now is a superstar lead scorer. And I do think that's a question a lot of people are asking around world basketball about the development. Huge positives for it. But maybe there is something to having these superstar guys coming through the junior ranks and getting up 40 shots a game. You know what I mean?
No, true. I want to ask you about NIL. Has that had an effect on the transition from players in Australia going to college? Has that played a factor in terms of which colleges they go to, and their decision making on money? Has that had any of effect by any chance?
Yeah, I think it has. And two names come to mind right now. Tyrese Proctor, who I mentioned, there was a 3-year guy at Duke. And if you go back to his first season, there were certainly some of the mock drafts that had him absolutely first round, but sort of fringe lottery at the start of that year at Duke. And he had a pretty good year, but he ultimately opted to come back for year 2. And year 2, he was kind of injury hit. He was decent. He might have gone in the second round, but he didn't have the most continuity that he would have liked. And we spent a week out at Duke hanging out with Tyrese and discussing with him, and his family was out there. And a lot of the conversation was just around what you can get out of college, and firstly, how you can develop as a basketball player, but then just the very real situation that these kids are in right now, or young men and young women, that if you're going to be a second-round pick, that's great, but can it be better for your career overall if you stay in the college game? You're in this system where you can develop and learn and upskill all of those skills that you have while playing in monster games, while also earning similar money to what you could as a second-round pick in the NBA. He went back for a third year. He played on that team with Cooper Flagg and Kon Knipple, Kaman Maluach, and now he ended up being drafted in the second round. But I think he's a better basketball player for staying in college for 3 years. So I think that these guys now probably feel less pressure to rush themselves into the NBA after 1 year, stay in college a few more years, make life-changing money potentially if you're lucky to be in that situation, and then come out the backside with a 10-year pro career. And we actually had, I'm not sure if you saw this, Justin, but we had an Australian player, Owen Foxwell, yesterday, and Jonathan Gavoni broke this news on Twitter. Owen Foxwell has been a pro for a number of years in Australia. He's 22 years of age, and he has agreed to go and play for LSU next year. Oh. And I don't know where this sits with you, but it's clearly very complicated. But the game has changed, and the opportunities these kids have to make a stack of money in college, whether you like it or not, I personally can't blame the players for going and taking this money. I think it's a bigger discussion around what it does to the development of these guys and probably the integrity of college basketball. But if the money's on the table, I know I'd be taking it.
Yeah, totally. I agree. And I think before there was so much corruption where these players were given money and it was under the table. And then you had issues where players were, just given like a cheeseburger, and then that's an NCAA violation. And
Right.
I've had a schoolmate back. He played for the University of Mexico, just talking about the struggles of him trying to get meals. And he was a star player. He played for Kansas, and he got transferred to New Mexico. And you'd think at a prestigious university like Kansas in basketball, he would be able to eat, but he could not. He's just struggling in terms of how many meals, and he's an elite athlete. So I do think, with these players, being able to get paid, I am totally for that, considering what it's happened before. But there's definitely needs to be some regulations, because it's kind of, I don't know, to veer it off to a little bit out of control at this point. But
No, I agree, and I don't pretend to be a college expert or understand the history of what that has looked like. I try and speak to people that are more well-versed, particularly at ESPN, and ask them questions about the way they see it. So, as I said, I think from the perhaps the innocence of college basketball, where you've got 18-year-old kids and 19-year-old kids, and now you do allow a situation where a 22-year-old multiple-year pro can go back and play college basketball. I think that there are some questions to be asked, but I put that more on what NCAA wants from college basketball, not the 22-year-old player who still really does need to develop, and they get offered this money to go and play basketball in the US. I don't blame the player, but certainly I think that it's going to continue to be a talking point, and it's going to be a point of frustration for a lot of basketball fans out there. And the questions whether you should have a 23-year-old pro playing against 18-year-olds doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you look at BYU, I mean, they had a lot of older players, you know, play against, 18, 19-year-olds. I mean, you take a look at, AAU or these workouts. I mean, the ages fluctuate in terms of who's playing against each other. So, I don't know, in my mind, it's not too much of a big deal. I just think in terms of these athletes and, getting paid, I just hope they learn financial responsibility,
No doubt.
saving their money. I think like Overtime Elite, I think they do a good job in terms of, teaching a lot of their athletes, financial literacy and, how to be a pro and navigating, hey, your pro career is not going to last forever. It's a short time in your life and how you transition afterwards. So I'm hoping that kind of manifests itself into the college game as well. Now that these college players are, earning a lot of money these days.
I would have needed some help. I'll put
too.
that on the table.
Oh, yeah. Me too. 100%. Yep. I want to transition to something I saw today on First Take, and they were discussing just the globalization of the game. And they mentioned, Kevin Durant had some comments in terms of the format of the All-Star game, in terms of how it was, the U.S. versus the world, and just kind of, I would say, just some negativity towards kind of, I guess, All-Star Weekend is overall just the NBA and focusing on international players. And to me, I just don't understand this criticism when the game is global. This is not it's not a American game, so to speak. I mean, it's over now. I mean, you have players all over the world that is, making up the NBA, which I think has made the league a lot better. But yet, I think there's been kind of some resistance towards that, just from some comments from Kevin Durant, LeBron, maybe towards this kind of format. So I just want to kind of get your feelings. You covering the league from just different perspectives. Have you seen that kind of resistance in terms of mostly we've heard about the positivity of the game expanding, but lately there's been some negativity towards that. And to me, that seems baffling, just in terms of why that's the case.
Yeah, it was interesting with the All-Star weekend, and I will say this, I love the idea of the world via the US, because I do think in a sporting sense, there is a natural competitiveness that comes out when you're saying, if you are from the US, and I can't put myself in those shoes, even though I live here, if you're from the US, you're like, I know, we'll take the world down. We'll take them down. We are the best in the world. Like, that's what the natural instinct for me, if you love sports and you're a competitor, that's what the natural instinct is. So I actually like the idea that they went Team USA with obviously the two squads and the Team World. Now, the problem for Team World was Giannis wasn't there, SGA wasn't there, and Jokic and Doncic, well, they don't exactly care about trying in the All-Star game. So it wasn't quite a true world versus the US. But I did hear Kevin Durant when he was asked about trying in the game. And to be fair, he was quite right when he said, hey, we get the old heads get the blame for not trying in the All-Star game. What about Luka and Jokic? Yeah. And he was proven to be exactly right. So I don't think that sometimes we see, well, these international guys, because of a player like Giannis and certainly a player like Wemby, who is ultra competitive, all of a sudden, and this is just the way that the narrative goes, all of a sudden the international guys care more and they're going to try more. That's just not the case. But I do love the fact that we have this US v world stuff that's starting to build. It was stoked at the Paris Olympics. I was fortunate enough to be there when we saw, obviously, Jokic with Serbia, this French team that is turning into a juggernaut. Germany has always been a FIBA powerhouse. And the thing that we're learning is that the gap is absolutely closing. Now, it does not guarantee that an international team is going to win gold. US should still be favorites at every tournament moving forward for the foreseeable future. But I think here in the US, it can be a little bit territorial about the world stuff.
Yeah.
But I kind of get that. I get that because on our shows, I can tell you now, I didn't have a strong, I wasn't sitting in the stands at the All-Star weekend losing my mind about the world losing the game. But I can guarantee you on all our shows before that, I was saying, yeah, the world's about to take you down. And then obviously they didn't. But that's part of the fun of it, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. You mentioned you're at the Olympics.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? Because I watch it on TV. It was, we cover basketball. It's fun, but just getting kind of that feeling of this visceral competition, I haven't really felt that in such a long time. Compared to watching the NBA, like watching that 2024 Paris Olympics, that entire tournament, I don't think I've really felt that intensity in quite a while. And I don't know if it was a little bit, after, I think it's the first Olympics after COVID. I don't know, maybe I'm biased in terms of, the emotions. It wasn't just the United States that's winning. It was the competition. It was just, the elite of the elite, playing in this high level tournament. And I think the rules had a lot to do with it as well. But you being there, what was kind of your perspective and witnessing that compared to you covering, the Australian League or with the NBL or just with the NBA? Did that kind of, hold anything special in terms of your observations, or do you think it was a great international tournament, but still, it kind of doesn't rival what you've seen before? Just curious your perspective on that.
There's something different about international tournaments when guys are playing for their country. And one question I get a lot, and before living in Connecticut, working at ESPN, I've been here for the last 3 and a bit years. Before that, I did around 3 years in Milwaukee, and obviously was around Giannis day to day as he sort of ascended to being an MVP type player. And there was always this conversation that I had in Milwaukee where people would ask and get frustrated, and I totally get it. If you're a Milwaukee Bucks fan, you're getting frustrated because Giannis wants to play for Greece every offseason, and he's just adding these miles on the legs. And the conversation I always had is, you don't understand if you come from the US and you have this sample of 35 all-star caliber players that you can choose from, then it's fine for you if 5 guys decide not to play. If you're from Greece, or for me, you're from Australia, it is a badge of honor for your NBA players to play for your country. And there is an extreme passion from these guys to play international basketball. They love playing for their NBA teams where they get hundreds of millions of dollars and it makes their life. But playing for your country is a passion, and so many guys are invested in that. And I think as other countries continue to get better, we are seeing that the USA is like, all right, we buy into this. And it's not that they didn't have the passion in years gone by, but at the Paris Olympics, I genuinely got the feeling that there was like, damn, the other countries are coming. And when it came down to clutch time, and it was Steph Curry, and it was Kevin Durant, and it was LeBron James, it was the most amazing basketball experience I've had. And I didn't care who won that game, but the crowds, obviously being in France, the home crowd was insane. But they were also so happy to see these megastars from the US in their country playing in a game and a level of that caliber. So there's something special about it. We heard Kevin Durant yesterday discussing the idea that he wants to be there in 2028 in LA. I imagine that's going to be an even higher standard of basketball. But to me, it's hard. We go to NBA games, we go to the NBA playoffs, the NBA finals, and you love it and you're invested in it. But there is something that different in your heart, whether it's the goosebumps, whether it's the nerves you have for USA and France playing, and you don't know why you're nervous about this.
Yeah,
it's just a beautiful thing. It's pure basketball. It's passionate basketball. And I think we saw that from fans all over the world, whether you were in Paris or you weren't able to be there. You probably felt it on your couch.
Yeah, totally agree. You mentioned that you're fired up for the second half of the NBA season. So take it any way you want it. Like, what are you observing? What's caught your eye? What should fans be paying attention to as we, make the march towards the playoffs?
Well, it's interesting because you said that you're in Denver before we hit record on this chat. And I know, and I totally understand why there's a lot of focus on the bottom of the standings and teams that potentially aren't exactly trying to compete right now because of this historic draft class that we have. Yeah. But I'm more focused on what we have at the top. And when I'm looking at the standings in the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference, I don't remember being at this point in the season, in recent years at least, where you sit there and you say, I think there is genuinely 8 teams. So in the West, you're looking at OKC and Denver and San Antonio, and maybe the Houston Rockets are in that mix.
Yeah.
We'll see about that. And then in the Eastern Conference with Detroit and the Knicks and the Boston Celtics, if they get Jason Tatum back there as well, and the Cavs who pick up James Harden, I think we could be set up for a unbelievable, historic postseason from the second round on, even some potential landmines in the first round. So I'm fired up, man. I know that it's easy to be negative, But I look at a game like the one we watched yesterday as we record this, as San Antonio, who handled Detroit, who days ago Detroit just beat down on the New York Knicks again. And I think it's anyone's guess. I don't know where you see it, but I think it's going to be an absolutely awesome playoffs. And I'd rather focus on the positives of the game than the negatives.
Yeah, I think so. I think my only thing is what we saw last year, where we're so competitive, and that was a great this playoffs in terms of the teams we're competing. I just don't want to see blowouts. Like, I get it when one team's superior to another, but when a team is, winning by 30, 40 points in the playoffs, I just think there's a competitiveness problem. So just as a fan, as a consumer, I can live with a 20-point blowout, even if it's a sweep, when one team's dominant over another. That's sports. That's the way it goes. But I just would like to see a team at least be competitive within the playoff picture. That's all I ask. And I think last year it did deliver. And I think you even saw the kind of the reaping of those rewards from the start of the season, the excitement that took place. So, yeah, I'm very curious what's going to happen with Detroit. I think this is they're the number one seed. So this is the first time Kate Cunningham and that team might be, seems like they could be the favorites coming out of the East, perhaps, and how they handle that pressure. And the Knicks having a lot of expectations in terms of their chief rival not being relevant this season. The door, it looks like to be open, even though the Celtics are currently ahead right now. I'm really interested in seeing that. And of course, I'm biased. You mentioned Denver. Of course, I'm biased in terms of seeing what Jokic is going to do. And I think the West is always stacked. And really Wemby, seeing him healthy, that was scary what happened to him last season. I'm hopeful that he remains healthy and that we see the Spurs with a deep playoff run. I'm kind of rooting for them just because I want to see Wemby and kind of some high pressure situations deep in the playoffs.
Think about the carnage we had last season with Damian Lillard and then Jason Tatum and then Tyrese Halliburton. That's just the one thing we don't want.
Exactly.
I've had a few conversations in the last few days. We've discussed it on our show. So when we think about the Denver Nuggets, I can't help but feel that it rides on the hamstring of Aaron Gordon.
Yeah.
And then you look elsewhere. OKC, can they get back to where they were if they don't have the version of Jalen Williams that we saw in last year's run? The New York Knicks at All-Star Weekend last weekend, we had a sit down with Jalen Brunson, and we were just talking through where this Knicks team is at. And even he was open to the fact that we are still a massive work in progress. Even though we're a top 3 offense in the league, we're trying to figure out where all the pieces fit, and we need to get everyone together. So they still feel like they, have some problems with a team like Detroit and the physicality. And I was at the Knicks and Houston Rockets game a couple of nights ago, and they looked like they were going to lose that game by 20-plus points. And you wonder whether the fourth quarter turnaround, you're down by 18 with around 10 and a half minutes to go, you come back and win the game. And I always wonder, with moments like that, were they able to get something together where they're like, okay, this is a game that we can look back on straight out of the All-Star break. We just got blown out by Detroit. Have we found something now defensively that we can carry through to a postseason run? Yeah. So it feels like a lot of these teams still have a lot of questions, but anytime they match up, the top 4 from either conference, I'll be locked in, I'll be on the couch, because I do think that any of those teams can beat each other. And I have no idea where we're going to be at in the NBA Finals this year. No clue at all.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, I hope the fans appreciate that, because I just remember watching the playoffs with the Eastern Conference, that there was only 2 teams that had any type of a shot.
Exactly.
So it's nice to where you have, a competitive Eastern Conference. To me, I wouldn't, with all the teams that might make it out of the East, I wouldn't count them out against, any team against the West. I would favor the Western Conference team, but I would sure think it would be competitive for sure. And I think that's a credit, Adam Silver, I've had my criticisms of him, but I think that's a credit to the league in making it a lot more competitive and a lot more, palatable for the consumer once the playoffs begin, in which you want to see a bunch of these series. It's not, you're just not interested in one playoff series. You want to see them all because it's quality basketball. So
yeah, and I think and I always say this, the NBA isn't catering probably to me or you, or to be honest, a lot of your listeners, because we're going to be watching all of these games anyway.
Exactly.
But if you're asking me if I have investment in the in-season tournament this year, the play-in tournament, I absolutely do, because if I look at the Eastern Conference, a team like Orlando just hasn't been able to figure it out and just hasn't been able to be healthy, but they are highly competitive. I'm big on the Atlanta Hawks. Now, I came into the season thinking that Porzingis, or maybe crossing my fingers that Porzingis would stay healthy. It didn't work out. Trae Young is gone. but I am at least curious about Jalen Johnson and whether Kuminga, who looks like he might play in the next day or so here, what he can bring to that team, and could they be at least a competitive first-round team, maybe? And then in the West, you've still got LeBron, you've still got Steph Curry, and you've got Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We focus at the top, but I think there's landmines for the first round for some of these teams as well, and I would not be surprised at all if we have an upset in the first round. I didn't even mention Minnesota and Anthony Edwards as well,
Right.
a team that's been to the conference finals the last 2 years. So I just think it's absolutely stacked.
Yeah, agree. It's really exciting. Kane, thank you very much for the time. Truly appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where you're located on social media, where they can catch your work, any upcoming projects, anything else our audience should be looking out for?
Yeah, absolutely. So just on Instagram, it's just Kane Pitman, my name. On Twitter, it's Kane Pitman. It might be Kane _ there, but anyway, you should be able to track me down there. For the moment, I'm only on Australian TV and New Zealand and all the countries out there in Oceania, but I'm working on it. You might see me on your TV soon here in the US. That's what we're crossing our fingers for. But other than that, you'll see me in arenas all over the place during the playoffs. So I'm looking forward to it, mate. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Kane, thank you very much for the time. Truly appreciate it. Good luck the rest of the way. Thank you.
You too, mate. Anytime. That was a lot of fun.